Welcome. This is the third of 3 workshops designed to build capacity of educators to leverage technology to deliver quality remote instruction. The first workshop focused on student engagement. The second workshop focused on monitoring student progress and providing feedback in a virtual environment. In this session, we will discuss designing effective instruction for a hybrid model. We provided a live virtual session of this training to Tennessee educators in March of 2021. While this is an asynchronous recording, we will still provide the discussion prompts and poll questions that we administered during the training. During this time, we will encourage you to pause the recording and reflect on these questions. Before we get into the content, we'll take a moment to highlight some key features in the Zoom platform that may be helpful to know if you implement this training virtually. The bar on the bottom is your control panel. You can mute yourself or hide your video using the microphone and camera buttons on the bottom left. We encourage you and those you meet with to leave your video on when feasible, particularly when using small group breakouts to help facilitate conversation. During the live session, we used the chat to gather responses from participants to a number of prompts. They also used the chat to submit questions along the way. If you decide to organize breakout room discussions, participants will see this message inviting them to join. If they need to return to the main room at any time during the breakout session, they can select the Leave Breakout Room button. Let's review the workshop agenda. We'll start with welcome and introductions, then we'll review the train the trainer structure. We will provide an overview of different types of hybrid learning. Then we'll focus on 2 types that are more commonly used in the region. And finally, we'll close with a wrap up and next steps. During the live session, we administered a poll asking participants about their professional role. You might consider adapting this poll for your own audience. One of the ways to enhance engagement is to establish social presence when presenting online. It's a way to facilitate communication so that you feel like you are engaging in human-human interaction rather than human-machine interaction. It sets a stage for things like getting to know each other and developing a sense of connection. Now we will take a moment for our workshop facilitators to introduce themselves and establish social presence by revealing something that they're looking forward to doing once the pandemic is over. When you're presenting this workshop, you might encourage participants to introduce themselves in the chat and share what they're looking forward to. I'll start. I am Mary Clute, and I am very much looking forward to seeing my parents. I haven't seen them in over a year, which is far longer than I've ever gone in my entire life without seeing them. Emma?
Hi, my name is Emma Pellerin. I am a research associate at REL Appalachia, and I'm looking forward to traveling. I'm planning some trips to Alaska and Ireland and Scotland, and really looking forward to that. Jill?
Thanks, Emma. So I'm Jill Marcus. I'm a technical assistance associate for REL Appalachia. And although I want to see my parents and travel, I also really want to get back to salsa dancing. I miss it a lot. So I can't wait to be able to dance again. Mnet, sorry.
It's okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Mnet Shibare, and I am a research associate at REL Appalachia. And one thing I'm looking forward to for when the pandemic is over is traveling to somewhere warm with a beach, because where I live, it snows even in April.
Great. Thanks, everybody. So before we get started with the content of today's workshop, we want to take a minute to acknowledge a group of educators from the region and representatives from the Niswonger Foundation. We've worked closely with them to design this workshop to specifically meet the needs of educators in Tennessee. And we are so grateful for their partnership on this work. The workshop facilitators are part of the Regional Educational Laboratory Program administered by the U.S. Department of Education Institute of Education Sciences. The 10 regional educational laboratories, or RELs, work in partnership with stakeholders to conduct applied research and trainings. The mission of the REL program is to support a more evidence-based education system. Through the REL program, we carry out 3 main activities. We conduct a wide variety of applied research studies. We provide educators and other stakeholders with training, coaching, and technical support needed to use research findings and evidence in the classroom to improve teaching and learning. And we disseminate findings from research in ways that educators and policymakers can use in practice. In short, the REL program offers support to state education agencies, local education agencies, and schools that helps practitioners use evidence-based practices. This isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. We at REL Appalachia are working with our states and districts on quite a diverse set of projects. In the Appalachia region, we partner with a variety of state and local stakeholders in Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, and West Virginia to work on several education-related issues, including improving post-secondary transitions, early literacy, using data and evidence across states, and more. For more information about the projects we're working on, we encourage you to visit the REL Appalachia website at the link shown on the screen. Now I'm going to turn it over to Emma to describe the Train the Trainer structure.
Thank you so much, Mary. Before we transition into the workshop content, I want to take a few minutes to review the Train the Trainer workshop series structure. This workshop is designed for you to take to your home district and present to your colleagues, either all at once, as we will do today, or in 3 sections. You can see that there are 3 sections of content: overview of hybrid learning, alternating hybrid learning, and synchronous hybrid learning. For each of these sections can be presented in a different session if that's what works for you. If you have more than 30 minutes to present a section, then you can allow for more time for interactivity. If you decide to present the sections on different days, you'll want to use the same welcome, introduction, overview, and wrap-up materials each time. It might be good to start thinking about whether it's possible to fit this content within a larger professional development effort that your school or district is making so that you can leverage those accompanying supports. For example, if your district has a professional development day scheduled where people have different options to choose from, this workshop could be presented as one of the options. To support you in delivering the trainings, we have developed a slide deck you can use in your trainings, handouts to share with your participants, and a facilitator's handbook. Here's what's in your facilitator's handbook: a section on how to use the facilitator's handbook, welcome and introductions, overview of hybrid learning, alternating hybrid learning, synchronous hybrid learning, and wrap up and next steps. Each section includes an annotated agenda, detailed content information that provides additional context for the slides, and descriptions and a rationale for the activities. We'll be modeling some of these activities, check-ins, and best practices today. We're sure that you have a number of effective facilitation strategies that you like to use that will work as well. At the end of the handbook, you'll find a section on best practices and facilitation that you may find helpful, as well as the materials you should distribute as handouts, some language you can use to invite people to attend your workshop, and some alternative suggestions for creating breakout rooms and polls. When you see this icon on the slides, it's a signal for you to refer to the handouts in Appendix A of your Facilitator Handbook. After each of our workshops, we want to offer some additional supports. We all know that just presenting information is never really enough. Good professional development includes opportunities for follow-up, individual attention, and interaction with other implementers. We are scheduling office hours when participants can get together to discuss any issues with presenting the training in their home schools, an FAQ document that will be available as a Google Doc for trainers to contribute to, and an email where you can send questions for our team to answer. Now I'm going to turn it over to Emma.
Thank you, Emma. Before we get into the details of the specific models, we want to take some time to talk about hybrid learning in general and share some best practices that can be effective no matter which model you use. K through 12 schools have been experimenting with new models of remote instruction during the COVID crisis. We want to recognize the fact that these models were imposed on you and your students during a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic. Circumstances have created the need for the model, regardless of whether it is appropriate for meeting students' needs or not, and we know that it can be a struggle to work under these conditions. What we're hoping to do today is to help you understand what the research says about how hybrid learning can be effective, in hopes that that information will help you work within the confines of the current situation. So the 2 models that are prevalent are alternating hybrid learning and synchronous hybrid learning. In the alternating hybrid learning model, teachers are teaching either to in-person students or to remote students, depending on the day. Some schools have divided the groups into smaller groups, with each student group having different schedules. For example, group A may be in person on Monday and Tuesday, while group B is in person on Thursday and Friday, and then all students are working remotely on Wednesdays. Other schools have all of the students in person together on some days, and then all the students at home on others. In the synchronous hybrid learning model, the classroom teacher works with in-person and remote students at the same time. For example, one group of students might come to school every day while the other is at home every day. These are the two models we will review in depth during this workshop. Before we get to the specific strategies for those two models, let's see what model you are using in your schools. At this point in the workshop, we ask participants to identify which model is being used in their district and one thing that teachers in their school or district find challenging about the model they are using. We encourage you to pause the recording and reflect on these questions before moving forward. Now let's talk about the research on hybrid learning. It is important to note that there isn't a lot of previous research on the two models we just described in K-12 schools. However, there are some findings from previous research that we can adapt to the models that are currently being used. Prior to COVID, educators and researchers were exploring a wide variety of instructional models that incorporated technology. We explored this literature and found evidence that online learning and models that provide a combination of in-person and online or remote learning can be very effective. Most of the research we are going to draw on was conducted looking at two models. The first is blended learning. Blended learning is where students and teachers are both in school, but the students are engaged in self-paced online activities with support from the teacher. Excuse me. Findings suggest that blended learning is beneficial for differentiating instruction and meeting individual student needs. Blended learning that provides a thoughtful integration of technology and careful planning can be effective in increasing student creativity, independence, and self-direction. In synchronous hybrid learning, this has been studied in the university setting. This research has suggested that this model has some benefits because it is flexible and can meet the needs of students' differing lifestyles. The research outlined several characteristics of effective blended learning, and we think it applies to any situation where students are engaged in remote learning. You can find this information on page 10 of the handbook. These are not different from the characteristics of good teaching in general, but they are worth pointing out. As we go through this list, you might want to think about some lessons you are planning and whether you can emphasize any of these characteristics. The characteristics include maintaining high expectations. Successful implementation occurred when there was a balance of rigorous work combined with sufficient support. A commitment to achieving equitable outcomes. This is because the needs and resources of all students must be considered and accommodated for hybrid learning to be effective. Competency-based learning, or at least a desire to move toward using competencies as a measure of progress, was also important. Competency-based learning acknowledges that all students are unique, as student progression is based on mastery of a unit rather than time elapsed since the unit started. And finally, valuing all learners. Hybrid learning is most effective when it is designed to provide appropriate learning opportunities for all students, including those with unique skills and needs. Prior to the pandemic, educators turned to blended learning as a way to personalize instruction to meet each student's different strengths and needs. Now I will turn it over to Jill.
Oh, I think that there's a technical
Little bit of a technical difficulty. Hold tight, please. Jill, can you unmute?
Sorry,
No worries.
should I start again?
Yes, please.
With hybrid learning, there's an even greater emphasis than before to home in on the instructional needs that will best serve students and trim away activities that don't directly lead to essential outcomes. Earlier in this workshop, we talked about some of the challenges of hybrid learning, one of which is that there's reduced time to work with students. So with hybrid learning more than ever, it's important to narrow your focus carefully. The first two questions listed here may be ones that you're used to asking yourself when designing any instruction, but the third question is the one that's new and different. So what essential knowledge and skills do you want students to acquire, and what experiences do they need to acquire that knowledge and those skills? Now, how can those experiences be provided in a hybrid learning model? And then how will you assess student learning? There are a variety of curriculum design models that can help a teacher organize instruction this way, such as universal design for learning, constructivism, competency-based education, and authentic learning. These are discussed in greater detail in handout 1 on page 33 of your Facilitator's Handbook. As an example of prioritizing instructional needs, I recently spoke with a teacher who talked about how this year he assigned only one chapter of the book Walden to his students. I asked him to tell me about the reasons for teaching Walden, to describe the essential learnings that underlie that piece of curriculum. He told me that the important thing was for students to understand how the historical, political, and social context of the time influenced an American author's writing. We agreed that 1 or 2 chapters of Walden, along with some samples from other books, were likely to be sufficient for students to acquire that understanding, and he felt a little better. I'm not saying that students should not read the whole book, but that the reasons for assigning a reading should be carefully examined and weighed against the practicalities of hybrid learning. So now what I'd like to do is lay out how I might think about planning a hybrid lesson for you to think about and critique. So I'll walk through my thinking and you'll have a chance to react to the ideas. So my first thought was for how to design a hybrid lesson, which is to think about all of the fun and engaging activities I did when I was an in-person teacher, and then try to rework them for the hybrid context. But it's never a good idea to begin lesson planning with an activity and then try to map it backwards to meet a standard. So I want to start fresh. I don't mean that I won't use any activities I've used before, just that I want to begin by looking at the standard. The one listed at the top of the slide is from Tennessee Academic Standards for Social Studies, Grade 7. Develop geographic awareness by analyzing interaction between humans and the physical environment. After choosing the standard, here's the process I used to design a lesson. And as I've said, you'll have a chance to think about it and to critique it. So beginning with, what essential things do I want students to know and be able to do? What I'm thinking is that I want them to be able to describe how geography shapes how people live in a place. And I want them to be able to discuss the costs and benefits of altering the geography of a place. So then I need to think about what experiences students need to acquire that knowledge and those skills. So I would have them look at how geography has impacted our town where we live and discuss whether, for example, we should turn the local pond into a swimming hole with a beach. And then I would also want them to examine how other cities and towns throughout the world are impacted by their geography. Now, the question is, how can these experiences be provided in a hybrid learning model? I would start by defining geographical features and then ask students to use the chat to list geographical features of our town, like the river, the hills, the rocky soil, things like that. Then I would use Google Sheets and have small groups of students work together to list how they think those features impact the lives of people in our town. I would also next divide the class into 2 groups, one to think about the pros and the other to think about the cons of turning the local swimming pond into the local pond into a swimming hole with a beach. And then I would ask each group on the Google Sheet to switch and comment on the other's work. Finally, I'd present information about how other cities and towns throughout the world are impacted by their geography and follow up with a matching game, like for example, in which location would you find a dense population? In which location would you find travel difficult? And we could discuss the responses. So after those activities, I would assess student learning by asking them to write a paper on one topic like deforestation or housing development and describe the costs and the benefits of those alterations. So during the live section of the workshop, we went through this think aloud activity and asked participants to reflect on the lesson plan's efficacy in a poll. This is a good time for you to pause the recording and consider how effective you think this lesson plan is. Specifically, does it home in on essential knowledge and skills? Does it provide the needed experiences? And does it work in a hybrid setting? What improvements or revisions would you suggest, if any?
Thanks, Jill. Now we're going to turn our attention to alternating hybrid learning model, where students are in class sometimes and online other times. One difficulty with this model can be that students do not value the online learning time in the same way as they value the in-person time. It can also be difficult for them to participate remotely for a variety of reasons, or they may not have the skills needed to work independently. We'd like to start by sharing some ideas about how to structure in-person time. An analysis of many studies that compared online and blended learning to traditional in-person instruction found that the impacts on student outcomes were greater when online instruction also included opportunities for face-to-face interaction with the instructor and/or peers. So it makes sense to use your more limited in-person time for these types of activities. These might include small group activities that allow for peers to interact or time for direct teacher-to-student feedback. Of course, there are limitations on the types of in-person activities students can engage in while maintaining social distance, so that needs to be considered when planning. One way to use in-person time for interactivity is called the flipped classroom. In a traditional classroom, most of the time is spent on acquiring knowledge. In a flipped classroom model, students engage with the instructional material before class, for example, through recorded lectures, and then the time in class is used to apply the material that they've learned. This method was first developed for use in higher education to use class time for the construction of meaning rather than for information transmission. This approach might be more appropriate for older students. The research we located examined the effectiveness of the flipped classroom with high school and college students. Younger students may find it more difficult to acquire new content without educator support. Our main message, however, is that if you are spending a lot of your in-person time delivering new content to students, consider whether this could be done during asynchronous time instead. There are lots of ways you can implement flipped classrooms. The research covers some things that worked at the high school and college level, including quizzing the students to see how well they understood the material that was provided before class, or having them work in group activities where they apply their knowledge. During the live version of this workshop, we asked participants to respond to the following question in the chat. How might this concept work for you with your students? Are there things that students can do on their own so that when they meet with you, they are prepared to apply knowledge they gained independently? This is a good time to pause the recording and reflect on this question on your own. If the flipped classroom doesn't sound right for you in all cases, some researchers have suggested approaching the matter from the other direction. That is, you can use your in-person time to introduce new concepts and then give them assignments to work on independently that help them learn more and apply their knowledge. Some ideas include having students collect data and evidence, complete additional reading, engage in written reflection, work in small groups to complete a task, prepare a presentation that they'll deliver when they return to class in person, or engage with interactive materials rather than static worksheets. Some of the research with K-12 students has demonstrated that when students engage with interactive materials, they outperform students who participated in the same lesson without the interactive materials. In this studies, the interactive materials included things like electronic field trips and web-based science labs.
At this point in the workshop, we moved participants to virtual breakout rooms to engage in a discussion about the best way to use in-person time in an alternating hybrid model. We asked them to review the research on page 26 of the handbook before beginning their discussion. This is a good time to pause this recording to review the research and reflect on these questions on your own. You might also think about how this activity might work when you deliver the training. Now I'm going to turn it over to Jill.
Thanks. Okay, so now we're going to turn our attention to the synchronous hybrid learning model, where teachers are working with students in person and online simultaneously. This can be particularly difficult when there's not adequate technology to allow teachers and in-class students and online students to see and interact with each other easily. Teachers may not feel connected to students, students might not feel connected to each other, and this lack of connectedness can lead to a lack of motivation to be invested in learning. So I have a friend who before the pandemic took a college course that was designed for synchronous hybrid learning. The classroom was set up with students sitting around a table, and my friend had an iPad logged in so that her face was visible on a tablet that was set on a tripod that she could control by remote control using a joystick, and she could turn it to face whoever was speaking or to look at the whiteboard. And she found this to be a highly effective mechanism for participating in class. And her fellow students, once they got used to it, included her in activities and discussions fairly seamlessly. They even gave her tripod a t-shirt to wear. Now, I'm sure that this amount of technological support is not available to you and your students, but it represents an ideal to strive toward. How can connectedness and communication be established in a hybrid classroom, even with limited technology? The research identified connectedness and communication as two keys to successful synchronous hybrid learning. So we'll look at strategies for each of these. So starting with connectedness, let's look at some strategies that have been shown to be effective in establishing connectedness. You can find details about the research on page 36 of your handbook. The research we located highlighted that it's often a challenge for both the in-person students to feel connected to the online students and for the online students to feel connected to one another. But it also highlighted strategies that can enhance connectedness for both groups of students. These include using small groups. One study we located compared different approaches to grouping students and found that it worked better to group online students together and in-person students together. And this seems counterintuitive, but the researchers found that it allowed for a common shared experience for groups, and it reduced frustration. Using technologies that are needed for communication and for as much as possible, using technologies to enhance communication and serve pedagogical purposes. In this model, it's easy to get overwhelmed by all of the technology. So this is a good time to pare things down to just what you need to establish social presence, facilitate communication, and meet your instructional needs. You might also consider minimizing transitions between technologies and between whole group and small group time, as these transitions might be disruptive. Of course, it's also a good idea to test out any technology you are planning to use beforehand to the extent possible. Finally, promoting the feeling of the class being a cohesive group by avoiding language like here or there that makes students feel they are in two separate groups. Instead, you might just refer to students by name. Along with connectedness, the ability for teachers and students to communicate smoothly with each other and with the teacher has been shown to improve the synchronous hybrid experience. You can find details about the research in handout 1 on page 36 of the handbook. The research listed some crucial elements that were needed for this environment to be successful and to ensure that all students are engaged. Giving balanced attention between both groups, ensuring the audio quality is good, and tailoring activities to the model. So this might include being very intentional about where activities like demonstrations happen in the classroom to ensure that everything happening falls within view of the camera. One tip that emerged from one of the studies we located was that you could consider partnering every online student with a student in the class. If the teacher is having a hard time monitoring the chat while teaching, the partner who is present in class could alert the teacher to the online student's question. course, one challenge with this is that the partner needs to pay attention to the chat, which could be distracting.
Thank you, Jill. At this point in the live workshop, we moved participants to virtual breakout rooms to engage in a discussion about how teachers can establish connectedness and communication, effectively manage group work, and promote student engagement in a synchronous hybrid setting. This is a good time to pause this recording to reflect on the questions on the slide and anticipate how this activity might work when you deliver the training. Now we'll spend a few minutes summarizing our learning. We hope you're able to use the information and materials we presented today as you work with your colleagues. Looking back at the characteristics of effective hybrid learning, think about what you can do to promote high expectations, attend to equity, enhance competencies, value all learners, or focus on social presence. How can you prioritize your audience's instructional needs? Are there elements of the flipped classroom that you might employ? What can you do to establish connectedness and ensure smooth communication? We modeled some of these aspects, but we know that you may have other ways to make sure that you work with your work with teachers is as effective as possible. Thank you all so much for your active engagement in the workshop and for all that you do for your students. As a reminder, we're providing the following supports after each workshop to interested participants. When you are presenting this workshop, you may want to consider supports that you can provide to teachers in your district to discuss and answer follow-up questions about the workshop material. Here is our contact information if you would like to reach out to us. Thank you so much.